Thank you, Gail. Some of you may be asking, what's a guy with my skin color doing up here anyway? I could answer that by saying that I played a major role in organizing this panel, along with Professor Ela and Professor Vene and the wonderful students at UDC, but that's not a good enough reason. That's not a good enough reason. I could tell you that I think that race is an arbitrary construct, that actually it has no real meaning other than, how well you tan. It's no different from eye color or height or left-handed or right-handedness in reality, in biological reality. But that's not an answer either, because we all know that race matters. For hundreds of years, for billions of people, race matters. It may be this arbitrary social designation, but people have lived and died because of it. And you can't understand American history without understanding the issue of race. From the 3/5 clause in the Constitution to the greatest, most deadly war ever fought in American soil, race matters. In fact, the parties of today are very much organized because of the great civil rights struggles of the 1960s. So from the civil rights struggles, where the Democrats went from the segregationist party to the party of civil rights, and the Republicans went from good old Senator Brooks of Massachusetts, who I have a lot of respect for. I'm afraid many of them went to the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, where they reached out to the white segregationists. Some would argue that's where the Republican majority exists today. So from that to Hurricane Katrina, race matters. Don't let anyone tell you that the reason why Hurricane Katrina affected disproportionately poor, disproportionately black people was just a mix-up. It was just an accident. Mike Brown was incompetent. Don't let anyone tell you that. Because hurricanes lift up roofs of houses, and we get to see what's going on underneath. And what was going on underneath in New Orleans was grinding poverty, and disproportionately black Americans were suffering that. And that was going on long before Hurricane Katrina. And if we don't do something about it, it will continue long after in America. So race does matter. It shouldn't, but it does. And the question is, well, what is this president doing about it? Don't look around and say, Mike Brown, he's incompetent, that's the problem. The question is, why was he there in the first place? I mean, Mike Brown would have been perfectly competent if Katrina had not been a hurricane, but an Arabian horse trading fair, right? He would have known exactly what to do then. Who put him in power? President Bush, or the people behind President Bush. It doesn't really matter, does it? That's why he was in power. And don't think that Bush always appoints incompetent people. I guarantee you, the head of the Department of Energy knows something about oil companies. George Bush cares about oil companies. For poor people, for African Americans, for emergency management, he has other priorities. He has other priorities. Bill Clinton had a priority, right? We know James Lee Witt, the head of FEMA, had been doing emergency management for 3 decades. We also know that the people of New Orleans came to George Bush before the levees broke to ask for money to shore up the levees. The Army Corps of Engineers asked for money. The New Orleans Times-Picayune did a 7-part series on the deluge that was coming, and a pittance came out. George Bush spent 1,000 times more on the war in Iraq. He had other priorities. So does this mean, as Kanye West says, that George Bush doesn't care about black people? I don't know. Hard to know a man's heart. But we can know his priorities. We can also look and see who were the people who taught him his values, right? Let's see what his mother, Barbara Bush, had to say on this issue. When looking at the survivors of Hurricane Katrina in the Houston Astrodome, the people, many of whom had lost friends and family, most of whom had lost all of their belongings, what did she say? Quote, "And so many of the people in the arenas here, were underprivileged anyway. This is working very well for them. What I'm hearing, which is sort of scary, is they all want to stay in Texas." This is the president's mother, Barbara Bush. Is that a racist comment? Perhaps. But it's not the intent that matters, it's the policies. Listen to her words as they reflect what I think are Republican policies. Her view is that they were underprivileged anyway, right? They were underprivileged anyway. America has no responsibility to them. They were underprivileged anyway. They should be happy just to be getting those meals. Heck, maybe they'll even get a job one day at McDonald's. They were underprivileged anyway. They just didn't matter. They weren't that important. In my view, the Democratic Party has always stood for equal opportunity. The idea that every American, regardless of race, regardless of poverty, can achieve something if they work hard and play by the rules. And I fear that for the Republicans, it's just not a priority. I don't think it's a coincidence that poverty went down every year of the Clinton administration and up every year of George Bush's. And I think the reason is the Republicans feel like, you know what, poverty, underprivileged, that's just not the government's business. It should all be the private sector. Let charities take care of people in need. Well, if you read today's front page of the Washington Post, you know that charities alone just can't do the job. And you might say, well, okay, Mark, okay, George Bush, he's not real fond of poor people, but it's not a racial thing. But then you look at the voting. You look at the fact that the Justice Department has approved all of the states that want to violate the Voting Rights Act. States like Georgia that want to require voter IDs and new poll taxes and not even provide a place in black neighborhoods in Atlanta to get those voting IDs. You look at the fact that in the Ohio elections, there were far fewer voting machines in black neighborhoods than white neighborhoods. And you can say, you know what? It's not blacks. It's the fact that blacks vote for Democrats, and Republicans don't want Democrats to have the right to vote. I think after all these years, after all we fought for in the Civil War and the Civil Rights Act, that is simply no excuse. There's a reason why George Bush has a 2% approval rating in the black community. And I just think he has other priorities. And I think it's important to discuss what his priorities are and what they should be. I'm not saying the African-American community doesn't have to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, but this government has a responsibility as well. His priorities, I think, should be American priorities. And one of the American priorities has got to be the issue of race. Thank you.